Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is the second of the 2 extra episodes we're putting out this week, with another selection from the PPF Plus archive. Again, this is an episode that we put out last summer, 5 more extracts to give you a chance to hear what you might have been missing. In what follows, you're going to hear extracts that don't have a common theme. We tried to find a common theme, but there really isn't one, except we think of ourselves as a pretty eclectic podcast, and we hope that all of these extracts are, in their different ways, thought-provoking. First up, from our series about great political films, I talked about what is my favourite funny political film, In the Loop, by Armando Iannucci. In that film, one of the jokes is about a politician who is always on the brink of resigning. But it's not simply funny. It's also a reflection of something that was going on in British politics at that time that was very far from funny, with very serious consequences. After that, it's a part of my conversation with Robert Saunders about the Brexit referendum in 2016, and its consequences for British politics today, and the big puzzle of British politics today. Why is it that the referendum result is so unpopular now, but the man who was responsible for it, Nigel Farage, is perhaps on the cusp of being our next Prime Minister? We talk about that. Then, a conversation with Shannon Vallor that I had in our series on thinking about thinking machines, in which we talk about the future of AI. But Shannon explains why that's a bit of a misnomer. We think AI is about the future, but so much of it is drawing on our immediate past. That is the data that it draws on in order to tell us who we are. And far from solving our problems for us, it's another way of allowing us to keep repeating the same mistakes. Then back to the film series, and the episode I recorded about High Noon, which turns out to be the favourite film of many American presidents. And I talk about why that should be so and why it's so interesting politically, before finally an extract from the conversation that I had with Alec Ryrie as part of our series on revolutionary ideas. We were talking about Calvin and Calvinism. And this is where I ask what the difference was between Calvinism and Puritanism, which leads into a conversation about the role of Calvinism in the rise and fall of South African apartheid. All coming up, we start with In the Loop. But the film is also a satire of political courage, and here the central figure is the character played by Tom Hollander, the minister Simon Foster. A very, very weak human being. Small, ineffectual, humorous, wry, not easily intimidated. Presumably, you don't get to be a cabinet minister by being easily intimidated, but kind of clueless. But in his own mind, he's a man of principle. And he is against the war. So when he said it was unforeseeable, he was both trying to toe the line and keep his job, and also to say what he thought, which is that we shouldn't go to war. And at one point he says, I did not come into politics to do this, to send people to their deaths, to embark on an unnecessary war. And at various points, he comes close to deciding that it is a matter of principle that he resign as a stand against the war. And he floats the idea. He asks people to float it with nods and winks. And when he's asked how big a nod, he says, not too big a nod, but a big enough nod. At one point, he says he's on the verge of taking a stand. And when someone, Malcolm Tucker, says back to him, so you're taking a stand? He says, no, I'm not taking a stand. I'm on the verge of taking a stand. It's crucial that I'm still on the verge. I haven't actually taken a stand. But as it becomes clear that particularly the vote in the United Nations is going to be manipulated in order to allow the war to go ahead, he decides that maybe he really ought to resign. And he lets it be floated that he's going to resign. But even after that, he has his doubts. And there is a beautiful scene that takes place in the back of a taxi involving his special advisor, his press officer, Gina McKee, and himself, in which he ruminates out loud about the question of political courage, political morality, and what he should do. And he wants to know what is the brave thing to do. And he says, is the brave thing here to take a principled stand and to quit my career? And Gina McKee, his press officer, says, yeah, that is the brave thing to do. And as though she hasn't spoken, he says, is that really where political courage lies? And she says, yeah, no, that is where political courage lies. He says, but alternatively, would the really brave thing to do be to stay in my position? And even though I know the war is wrong, fight from the inside. And she says, no, that's not the brave thing to do. And again, he carries on. Does true political courage lie in having the courage, even when you know that something is wrong? Nonetheless, and she says, no, that's not courage. Courage is quitting. But Toby, his special advisor, who is keener to support his minister, says, I think it's a very interesting question. Maybe actually the easy thing to do is to do the right thing. Where is the courage in doing the right thing? Maybe, minister, actually, where the real courage lies is in doing the wrong thing. And you can see Simon Foster, the minister's, eyes light up at the thought that there's another way round this question, which allows him to put off doing the thing that he doesn't want to do. There is an old adage, which is if you are in a moral quandary and you're not sure what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do, the right thing to do is the thing you don't want to do. That's usually the best test. The thing that you're trying to justify to yourself is almost always the wrong thing to do. And that is certainly true in this case. But he clings on, and he clings on past the point where his resignation could make any difference. In a slightly contrived aspect of the plot, there is a sub-story involving a wall in his constituency, which is falling down. And the fact that he's ignored this suddenly becomes a press issue because Malcolm Tucker lets the press know that they can run with the wall story. And he uses it as a pretext to encourage the Prime Minister to fire Simon Foster. And when Simon Foster says to him, when he hears from Malcolm Tucker that he's being fired, well, the Prime Minister can't have done that because I know you haven't spoken to the Prime Minister since we started this conversation. And at the start of this conversation, I hadn't been fired. Malcolm Tucker makes it clear that he makes those kinds of decisions. And so Simon Foster achieves nothing. The general, James Gandolfini, doesn't resign either, not because he's sacked in his case, but because he does a version of that thing, which is it braver to stay on and do the wrong thing than to do the right thing? By deciding that he can't resign because now there is going to be a war. He's a soldier, he's a general, and he can't abandon his kids, the soldiers, to the dismay of Karen Clark, the Assistant Secretary, who's the only one who does have the courage to hand in her resignation. The satire here is in part about a particular British politician, and I think it's pretty unfair if this is the person that this sequence is meant to bring to mind, because Simon Foster in this film is a fictional Secretary of State for International Development in the run-up to a war which is a fictional Iraq war. The real Secretary of State for International Development in the run-up to the real Iraq war was the politician Claire Short, who had been Secretary of State for International Development for 6 years. And if this is the comparison we're meant to draw, it's extremely unfair because Simon Foster is a hopeless lightweight, an excuse for a politician. He doesn't know what he really believes about anything. He doesn't know why he's in politics. Claire Short was a serious heavyweight politician. She was a cabinet member for 6 years, and in that role, she did a lot of important things. She had her critics, on the right particularly, but she was a real player in Tony Blair's government. But it is also true that she was well known to be a critic of the Iraq war. She didn't believe in the war, and she gave a notorious interview in which she described Tony Blair as reckless in his approach to the war. That's a lot stronger than war is unforeseeable. And she floated through nods and winks and so on the idea that she would resign if Britain went to war, particularly if Parliament voted for war, and this was a war that had to be sanctioned by Parliament. She would leave the cabinet. But she didn't. And the crucial parliamentary vote was one in which she supported the government, having said that this was a resigning issue. And then 2 months later, after the first phase of the war, the shock and awe phase, she resigned. When it was clear that the war was just beginning, to be the disaster that it became. She did resign. She resigned on principle. It was a brave thing to do, but it wasn't, frankly, as brave as it would have been to resign before the vote in Parliament. But it wasn't all like that. And In the Loop does not offer anything like a full picture of British politics in the run-up to the disaster that was the Blair government's decision to join the Americans in that invasion, the disastrous manipulation of intelligence, the disastrous loss of public trust as a result. There were people who behaved with genuine courage. Preeminent among them was the most senior politician in the British government who did resign, Robin Cook, who had been Foreign Secretary at the time of the Iraq War, was the leader of the House of Commons. He was the person who did most to ensure that the Commons had a vote on the war. And realizing he couldn't vote for the war, he handed in his resignation, and then the night before the vote, the 17th of March 2003, before the vote on the 18th of March, after which Britain was at war, Robin Cook gave a speech in the House of Commons, which I think is the greatest parliamentary speech of my lifetime. And I rewatched it after watching In the Loop to remind myself. And it struck me again, just as In the Loop struck me as my favourite, funniest political film. Robin Cook's speech struck me as the great speech of its time, of our time. And it is partly because it is the opposite of In the Loop. And it's the opposite because of the way it uses language. It's not a funny speech. It lasts about 12 minutes. It's not a funny speech. It's quite a lawyerly speech. The words really mean something. In the Loop, language is there to be exploded, to be made hilarious by becoming meaningless in its uses and abuses. This speech is one in which the words count because they are clear, they are precise in a lawyerly kind of way, and they mean what they say, and they say what they mean without flourish and without swearing. Robin Cook is clearly angry, but he doesn't sound angry. He sounds magnanimous. It's a very measured speech, and it makes the case against the war in clear, unambiguous terms. And the things that Robin Cook said in that speech turned out to be true. One of the most memorable lines in this film, uttered by Linton Barwick, when he's talking about the intelligence that will justify the war, is that he says, "In the land of truth, the man with one fact is king," i.e., we've got all the intelligence we need if we just hammer our one fact. And that does feel like quite a prescient comment about the information politics of our time. In the land of truth, the man with one fact is king. Robin Cook had seen the evidence. He was across the facts. And he said three things in that speech that were true. The first was that if Britain went to war with the United States without international agreement, without the relevant United Nations resolution having passed, without the sanction of the international bodies and of the allies, including France and Germany, with whom and on whom Britain's security depended, it would do long-term damage, not just to Britain's standing in the world, but to faith in those institutions. The price was too high. The collateral damage, whatever you thought about the rights and wrongs of the war, of effectively not an illegal war as such, he doesn't use that terminology in his speech, but of an unsanctioned war, the long-term effects would be catastrophic. And they were. And we are still living with the consequences. The second thing he said in that speech is that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction in any meaningful sense of that term. You could stretch the term weapons of mass destruction to mean something that it doesn't mean. But the way it was being presented to the British public, that he posed a real and present danger to them, was not true. Now, very few people were saying that in public. People had doubts about the intelligence. But Robin Cook said, not "it's my belief," he said as a fact that the weapons didn't exist. And they didn't exist. He was right. And he also said that he believed that the instincts of the British people were to be trusted. So I said earlier on in this podcast that one of the things about In the Loop that it has in common with Succession is it treats the public out there on whom all of this depends as noises off, as a background feature. They're real and they have to be taken account of, but they have no say in anything. They are essentially to be manipulated. And Robin Cook said of the Iraq War that the instinct of the British public, which was reflected in consistent polling, not just in the size of the protests against the war, but in polling, the majority were skeptical about the case that was being made for the war. And Robin Cook said, on this, we, the politicians, should trust the public. And he was right. If you watch that speech, it's fascinating because he's on the backbenches, he's resigned, so he's moved to the back of the Commons on his party side. Sitting to one side of him is Chris Smith, the person who appeared on this podcast recently to talk about The Candidate, his favourite political film, in which he mentioned his key role in the opposition to the Iraq War and those questions of principle on which a politician in the end does have to not just come to the verge of taking a stand, but taking a stand. There is Chris Smith. And on the other side of Robin Cook is Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, who then was a serial renegade Labour politician, almost never supported the government on anything, was often wrong, but in this case happened to be right. In a packed House of Commons, hanging on Robin Cook's every word, it's rare to see an audience so held by a dry and lawyerly speech. And when Cook sat down, which is not the polite thing to do, it's not etiquette in the House of Commons, the chamber erupted in applause. You're not meant to clap. It occasionally happens. You're not meant to do it. And it symbolizes something about the moral force of that speech, the truth of that speech. They applauded him. All of them. Maybe not all of them. The large majority of the MPs, and most of them were there in the chamber, applauded him. And then what did they do the next day? They voted for the war. It wasn't all like In the Loop, but some of it was.
I think one of the things that nobody predicted before 2016 was the volcanic effect that the result would have on British politics. It really brought British politics and arguably even the British Constitution to the brink of breakdown after the years that followed. And I don't think that's just because MPs behaved badly or didn't accept the result. It's because actually the referendum set up some really difficult structural forces. So it gave an instruction that Britain should leave the EU, but it gave no instruction on the terms on which Britain should leave or what kind of relationship should replace it. And those questions were almost as contentious as the debate on whether you leave in the first place. So that was a major problem. It also required something, I think, unprecedented in British history, which is it required a government that had no effective majority in Parliament. I mean, Theresa May had a small majority at first and then lost it in 2017. It required a government with a very small majority or no majority to carry through an absolutely world-shaking, fundamental and contentious piece of legislation. And that just never happens. So the parliamentary system couldn't really cope with the challenge that had been given. And we saw how that worked out over the years that followed. And I think actually that memory is really important to where we are now. Because if you look at the polls, it's clear there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Brexit. I think nearly 60% say that it was the wrong decision. Only about a third think that it was correct. Very large majorities will say that they think it's been bad for living standards, for the economy, and for British influence. And even leavers tend to say that it was botched in the actual delivery, then you might disagree on who they blame. But if you ask in a poll, what should we do now? You get a much more fractured picture. Only actually about 31% say that we should rejoin the EU. A similar number say we should improve the relationship while staying outside, whatever that means. And then you get all sorts of other fragments. And I think that's partly because there is a real reluctance, wherever people stand on Brexit, to go back to the nightmare of the 2016-2019 period, when this was all-consuming, when British politics felt really nasty and violent, and when our institutions and the parties themselves almost broke down. So I think Labour is trying really to put itself in that territory, to say we won't go back in, we won't reawaken the beast, but we will try to have a slightly better, more pragmatic relationship from outside. And I think in practical terms, that might be quite difficult to do. But politically, I think it's probably not far, actually, from where a lot of public opinion is.
One of the things that seemed to happen after 2016, but turns out to have been an illusion, is that it seemed briefly to restore the primacy of two-party politics, the two main parties. So in 2016, 17 in particular, the two main parties, Labour and the Conservative, got a huge proportion of the vote, well over 80% of the vote between them. Theresa May, in the memory, lost that election, but more people voted for her than almost have voted for any politician in British history. And a lot of people, a surprising number of people, voted for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. But that now feels illusory, and the 2019 election was a little odd and anomalous. But since then, a trend which maybe began even in 1975, the period from 45 to 75 was completely dominated by the two main parties. It really was turn and turn about, and all minor parties were just minnows in that political ecosystem. But from 75 on, it starts to fracture, because after all, it is from 75 on that we move towards what happens in the 80s, which is Labour splitting between the two wings in that referendum between Jenkins and Williams and Michael Foot. And the rise of the Liberal Democrats, the rise of the SNP, there's a little rise at the end of the 70s, but a much bigger and deeper and much more profound rise later on. And now an environment in which you've also got to factor in the Greens, Welsh nationalists, and of course, Reform. So that the last election was completely anomalous in British history, that a party could win a majority at all with 33.9% of the vote, never mind one of the biggest majorities in parliamentary history, as someone said, a mile wide and an inch deep. And that feels like, in some ways, it is an extension of this as a single story from 75 on, that referendum began a process with ups and downs, which has seen a fracturing of the hold of the two main parties to the point we are now, where I would say that the hold is broken.
Yeah, I think the 2017 election is really fascinating here because, as you say, it does seem to interrupt that long decline in the two-party system. Hart's actually been writing for a while about the decline of two-party politics, and suddenly there was this very awkward election in which that seemed to go radically into reverse. But I do think in lots of ways that election was an anomaly because it was a Brexit election in which Brexit barely featured. That actually neither side said anything serious about Brexit at all. The position of both leaderships was that they accepted the result and that they would deliver it, but they would do it better than the others. So Labour's position was that it would have a Labour Brexit or a Brexit for jobs. And so that wasn't really an alignment that could survive contact with the reality of Brexit politics, particularly given that you actually had two parliamentary parties that didn't really have any confidence in their leaders after 2017. Certainly the Labour benches had no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. The Tory benches very rapidly lost confidence in Theresa May. And there were mass expulsions when Boris Johnson became leader. So Brexit, I think, accelerated all of the disintegrative tendencies in the party system because it accustomed different wings of the party to rebel. It gave them a great cause in which they could do so. It allowed them to believe they were expressing the will of the people, whether that was for a people's vote or for one of the various deals. It accelerated the sense that the political class was in some way betraying the people and needed to be punished. It obviously magnified the presence of people like Nigel Farage and of his various political parties in the public realm. So it's almost like perhaps one of those fevers where the patient seems to recover before the final collapse happens. In a way, I think that's what 2017 looked like for British party politics.
Do you think that disintegrative process did maybe begin with the 75 referendum? I mean, the 75 referendum, maybe I'm putting two and two together and getting seven, but the 75 referendum was a very, very unusual event in British politics, and it was there because the party system was fracturing in some ways, the Labour Party in particular, and it seemed to pull it back together. But actually, we know it was only papering over the cracks, and in some ways, it might have exacerbated it.
I think the referendum is an expression of the disintegration of party politics that was beginning at that point. Europe is one of those issues that it turns out can't be contained within the existing party system, that it wasn't built around questions like European integration. So if you want to hold people like Roy Jenkins and Tony Benn in the same party, you've got to take it out of party politics. So it's an attempt to deal with that. One thing I think that was different in the 70s is that this is only just over 40 years after the catastrophic split in the Labour Party in 1931, When Ramsay MacDonald went into a national government with the Conservative Party, the Labour Party split and was almost wiped out at the next general election. So the memory of Ramsay MacDonald and his betrayal, the memory of what happens when the Labour Party destroys itself, was still very, very raw in the 70s. And Harold Wilson plays on that constantly. He's criticised now as somebody whose sole objective is to hold the Labour Party together. But he regarded that as in some ways quite an idealistic thing to want to do, not to be another Ramsay MacDonald, not to destroy the Labour movement. I don't think that emotional commitment to maintaining the unity of the party really still exists in British politics, with the possible exception of someone like Theresa May, who was clearly very anxious not to split the Tory party after 2016.
So we talked about how one way to think about these referendums were opportunities for people to express their much broader dissatisfaction with politics as usual, or with the political system, or the way in which democracy seemed no longer to be representing them, or maybe in their view really representing the people at all. And Nigel Farage has been an exceptionally skilled messenger for that message across his political career, though only recently did it get him into Parliament, but it was certainly very effective in his campaign to get Britain out of the European Union. But the sort of oddity, in a way, is that in 2016, he succeeded. He got his way. He managed to persuade 52% of people, not on his own, but with others, to vote to leave the European Union. And that victory has now led to him, 9 years later, once again being the coming man of British politics at the head of a party that is leading in the polls by expressing its deep dissatisfaction with politics as usual and the way things are going. And the message seems as powerful in Brexit Britain as it was in pre-Brexit Britain. Now, I know he's able to say because Brexit was never delivered, or it was betrayed, or they didn't really do what the people wanted, but still, I still find myself thinking, how's he done it? How has he done it?
The profitability side of AI is not going to be so easy for the AI platform companies to fix. I think the fact that public trust in AI is plummeting as well, and public affection for AI. A lot of people just don't want AI anywhere near their phone or, their office productivity software anymore. And they're fighting battles with companies like Microsoft that are saying, no, we're putting it in here and we're not asking. And the reason is because no one's inviting it in. There's much less interest in bringing AI into your life than there used to be, because people have now come to associate it more and more with something that's unreliable and something that might just be there to kind of steal your data and your intellectual property. And that's entirely on the fault of the AI platform companies who didn't roll this out right and didn't do it with a mindset of, hey, we have to do this responsibly if we actually want to build long-term commitment and trust and interest in this technology. They figured they could ram it down everybody's throats quickly and that everyone would be excited about it just because it was called AI, and that it didn't matter whether it was done in a responsible way. Well, turns out it does. But they also didn't think about the profit strategy long-term either. It was a race to the market to get to market first and then to capture as much of the market as quickly as possible without thinking about whether you could actually deliver return on investment for the people who are buying your services. And then we have the sustainability picture, which is we just cannot miss our climate targets again and again just so that we can invest in more AI, especially if AI is not making anybody a ton of money. That's just not going to wash. So I think there are some hard constraints, or if they're not hard, they're pretty tough constraints to overcome in the next 5 years or so for pushing the AI development cycle into a more accelerated mode. I actually think we might see a bit of a slowdown.
I want to finally ask you two questions about what you think about humans, as it were, the human side of this. So your book that we touched on in the series, and we really recommend people read The AI Mirror. And you've touched on its thesis, which essentially, this is too crude, but AI is telling us something about us because we built this thing, and how we conceive it and how we understand it reflects back to us some deep truths about who we are and how we see the world and some of our failings. And actually, as you were speaking then, I was thinking, one of our failings unquestionably is we hope AI is going to solve the climate problem. As you describe it, AI is making the climate problem worse. But the great thing is it does at least let us off the hook for a while. And so, as described by you, this is not a viable solution, because by the time AI solves the problem, it will have screwed us anyway over the climate. But you can see the appeal to human beings of a narrative that says, given climate change is so hard for us to solve, we need to rely on this smart technology we're building to solve it, as though these were two completely separate things rather than completely independent, because they both come out of the way in which we human beings extract energy and resources from our natural lived environment. I mean, these are just part of that same story. What does AI now tell us about us? What does, how does it reflect us back to us? I know it's a big question. You've written a book about it, and you're going to have to give the very short answer. But what are we seeing in the mirror when we look into the fake eyes of the non-robots that we're building?
The short message of the book is what we're actually seeing is the past. We're not seeing the future at all. And that's how these tools are marketed to us. They're marketed as a window into the future. But what they actually are, like all mirrors, are windows into the past. Think about the way that space telescopes, which are built from mirrors, work. They work by collecting light that arrives after a long period of travel from the early age of the universe. And so that's what allows us to literally see back in time. AI mirrors look back in time. They look back through the history that we have digitized, the history of our speech, the history of our decisions, the history of our behaviors, the history of our judgments and our values, everything that we've encoded. And they extract the most dominant patterns from that history and project them forward as predictions of what we will do next. The philosopher Mark Kokelberg has called this property of AI a kind of curious time machine capability. So he says AI is a time machine because it allows us to actually reach into the past and suddenly bring the past into the future. But it's doing that at exactly the moment where we need to depart from the past, where we need to break those patterns, where we need to steer in new directions. And that is exactly the thing that today's AI tools are actually quite poor at helping us do. Because what these tools are designed to do, again, is find the most dominant and predictable and likely patterns, which is a sense to say, what is likely is what we've done most often before. But think about using something to set policy, to inform decision makers, even to guide and advise ourselves. Think about building a machine to do that is determined to make us repeat all of our past mistakes. And that right now is what I fear the AI ecosystem is structured to accomplish. And yet, what we need is an AI ecosystem that will actually help take down the barriers that stand in the way of us reasserting our agency and our capacity for change. One of the things that, more than anything else, blocks a path to sustainable flourishing and a path through the climate horrors that we've already locked in, but a path that shepherds the human family safely over to the other side with as few losses as we can manage, that path requires human confidence. It requires the human family to believe that it can cooperate. It requires the human family to believe that it can cooperate in ways we've never cooperated before. It requires the human family to believe that human agency is worth saving and that human agency can save itself. It requires believing in the capacity for people to accept responsibility and make sacrifices. And AI is designed in a way to create a kind of passivity and resignation. When we look at the failings of ourselves and one another's, when we look at the failings of the human past, it's very easy to give up hope and say, well, look, humans just aren't very good at thinking, at making judgments that are good in the long term. We're not very rational. We're not very compassionate. We're not very good at making the sacrifices for one another that we need to make. So how much worse could the machines do? And that's the logic that Silicon Valley is selling right now, is to tell you that you're actually not a very good thinker at all, that you're not actually someone who's particularly free to make new choices, that you're pretty much a predictable machine, and that they've built a machine that's even more accomplished at predicting where you will go next, and that you can then surrender your own agency to the machine. Just let the machine tell you where things are going, and it will take us there. But the machine is designed to take us where we've already been, over and over and over again. It's designed to create the same narratives again and again and again, just in slightly statistically fuzzed forms that will still feel familiar, that will still feel comfortable, that will still feel like what we want. And that's exactly the wrong prescription if we're going to meet the challenges that are coming to the human family from climate change, from rising economic inequality and political instability, geopolitical tensions. All the things that we're facing require us to actually have more confidence in human wisdom than we've ever had before. And yet the AI ecosystem and the media narrative around it is designed to strip you of that confidence and to make you believe that turning things over to machines is the only way that you'll save yourself and that we'll save each other.
And it's part of the problem that the past that these machines project into the future is overwhelmingly the very recent past. The deep history of the human race, there's some really bad stuff there. And I think I do still believe in some version of progress. But there's also a huge amount of variety there. And there's a lot of interesting work that's been done by all sorts of people, anthropologists and others, that trying to persuade us that the narrative that we tell about the 20th century being the culmination of something misses out all of the ways and paths and varieties of histories that we could have gone down. But this is overwhelmingly what is the data sets, what is available for these machines. It's overwhelmingly us. I mean, literally us, not the human species, but the people who are alive now. And so almost by definition, we're the people who are failing to solve the problems. We know that. And it's literally the people who are failing to solve the problems and their imaginations. I think our political imaginations are pretty shrunken at the moment. And it is those imaginations that are being projected into the future. And actually a deeper history has more variety in it.
I think that's true. And it's not just about the depth of the past that is mined by these models and reflected by them, and the fact that currently the depth is pretty shallow and that it's overwhelmingly dominated by narratives from the last century. That's certainly a factor. But it's also primarily dominated by narratives from the last century that are taken from the global north, that are derived from European and Anglo perspectives on politics, on history, on industry, that are shaped by the kinds of values that industrial and particularly post-industrial society has championed.
I've got a list in front of me of, as far as we can tell, the favourite movies of all American presidents going back to Woodrow Wilson, more or less back to the start of the movies. So some of these are the films that they said were their favourites in interviews, or films that they showed repeatedly in the movie theatre that exists in the White House. Franklin Roosevelt created a family movie room in 1942 for presidents to relax in and show their favourite films to family and friends. And it seems like pretty much all presidents since have used that room quite extensively. If you look at the list, some of it is pretty predictable and not that interesting. Apparently Joe Biden's favourite film is Chariots of Fire. Barack Obama, it's The Godfather, parts 1 and 2. As he says, part 3, not so much. He's not wrong there. George W. Bush, it's Field of Dreams, that very schmaltzy film about baseball, fantasy baseball. George W. Bush had been the owner of a baseball team, co-owner, the Texas Rangers. He was pretty schmaltzy about baseball. It's an inoffensive choice unless you're offended by schmaltz, in which case it's not inoffensive at all. Jimmy Carter, sentimental politician from the American South, his favorite film is Gone with the Wind, a sentimental film about the American South. Apparently, John F. Kennedy said that his favorite film was Dr. No, the first Bond film, which came out in 1962. So during his time in the White House, he seems to have somewhat predictably liked the character of James Bond. I'm not sure there are great revelations there. But what really stands out about the list is that many of the other presidents had as their favorite film a Western. Westerns seem to be the film of choice of American presidents. And I think the genre that has been shown most often by far in that movie theatre in the White House is Westerns. So this goes all the way back. Warren Harding said his favorite film, this is in the silent movie era, was a silent Western called The Covered Wagon. Lyndon Johnson's favorite film was John Ford's The Searchers. George H.W. Bush said his favourite film was Viva Zapata, an American Western, but about the life of a Mexican revolutionary hero. That film, incidentally, was also apparently the favourite of John McCain. But one film comes up 4 times. It's the only film that comes up more than once. 4 presidents seem to have had as their favourite movie High Noon, Fred Zinnemann's High Noon, which came out in 1952 and was the favourite film of Harry Truman, of Dwight Eisenhower, of Ronald Reagan, and is the favourite film, apparently, of Bill Clinton. So if it came out in 1952, that is right at the end of Truman's presidency. Before that, he had said that his favourite film was another Western, My Darling Clementine. But when he saw High Noon, it became his new number one. Eisenhower showed apparently lots and lots and lots of Westerns in that White House movie theatre, but his favourite was High Noon. Sometimes Ronald Reagan said his favourite film, predictably perhaps, was It's a Wonderful Life, maybe the schmaltziest of them all, but also he loved High Noon. And Bill Clinton has consistently been clear that his favourite film is High Noon. It was shown multiple times in the White House screening room. He saw it as a child. He loves it to this day. So there's something going on. There's some kind of relationship between American presidents and High Noon. And I think it's really interesting trying to work out what that relationship is. It's not surprising because it is a really great film. So it's completely plausible that people would have this film as their favorite. You don't have to be a president to love it. It's a magnificent Western, even for people who don't particularly like Westerns. It is the story of the marshal of a small southern American town, played by Gary Cooper, who is about to retire. He's retiring that day. The first thing that happens in the movie is that he gets married. And then it plays out in real time over the course of about 80 minutes. It's a real-time movie. He discovers that at noon, he's got married in the middle of the morning, at noon that day, a man called Frank Miller, who is an outlaw, and who the Gary Cooper character, who's called Will Kane in the film, has successfully convicted. He was sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, but he's just discovered by telegram that northern politicians, the implication is something deeply corrupt has happened here, have let Frank Miller go. He's been released. And he's coming back to wreak revenge, and he's coming back on the noon train. So at midday, this man's going to arrive in town, and it's pretty clear to everyone the first thing he's going to do is try and kill his nemesis, Will Kane. And then we see, over these 80 minutes, Will Kane prepare for this event, try and persuade the people in the town to back him up, to stand up to the outlaws. It's a gang of outlaws, including Frank Miller's brother, so it's the Miller gang. They're coming to get them. Everyone knows what's going to happen. And we see Will Kane try and persuade the people of this town to back him up in defending the town against the gang that he drove out of town. And they won't do it. One by one, they let him down. They tell him to leave town. They argue that it's more trouble than it's worth. They're scared. Multiple reasons why. And he's left to fight alone. And he does fight alone. And he triumphs. It's a great film. It's very suspenseful. It's got a bit of a feel of that TV series 24 about it. The clock is ticking. You know something terrible is going to happen in real time. It's agonizing to watch in places, but you also have a feeling the good guy is going to win. It's a redemptive tale. Gary Cooper is magnificent and magnificently surly in this film. But there are 2 other reasons, I think, why it's very interesting that American presidents like it so much, these 4. And it's quite an ecumenical list. So we're talking about 2 Republicans, Eisenhower and Reagan, 2 Democrats, Truman and Clinton. We're talking about a soldier, Eisenhower, and a draft dodger, Clinton. We're talking about a movie actor, Ronald Reagan. The reason it's so interesting is first because this is a very political film. So it was conceived as a political allegory. It was meant to be read in 1952, read and of course watched, as an allegory about McCarthyism. But also there's something else going on here. I think this is a film that might have a particular appeal, not just to politicians in general, but to politicians who have reached the very top, the pinnacle of the political profession. It happens in this case in the United States. President is the best you can do. It speaks to them about probably their own sense that at various points they could have given up. Along the way, there will always have been people who have told them to leave town, that the fight is not worth it, that they are outmatched, that they are outgunned. And by definition, if you wind up as president, you didn't listen to those people. And also, by definition, if you wind up as president, those people were wrong. But first, the McCarthyism, because that is the central political message of this film. It's not completely obvious, though I think it would have been obvious at the time. So no question, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower would have seen what was going on in this film. Bill Clinton gave an interview about 10 years ago, I think 12 years ago in 2012, in which he discussed why High Noon was his favorite film. And he said he saw it as a child and he had no idea that it had a political subtext. It was only later, after multiple viewings, as he said when he read about the movie, he says, my favorite film, so I thought I should read up about it, a very Bill Clinton thing, to think he should do his research, that he discovered that this was a film made at the height of McCarthyism in defense of those people in Hollywood who refused to name names, who refused to tell the House Un-American Activities Committee in Congress who the communists were in Hollywood. It is a defense of the courageous few against the craven town, the town in this case being Hollywood, the implication being most people in the town have a good reason not to stand up to the bullies. The bullies here are the McCarthyites, the people who are trying to root out the Reds, the communist threat, in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And when this film came out, 1952, McCarthy was still, in a sense, at the height of his powers, and in many ways going further and further in his denunciations of communist infiltration of government and of media and, of course, of Hollywood. And this film was about the few heroes, the heroic few, who refused to play ball because most people were not that brave. It was much easier in Hollywood to play along with the witch hunt. Not necessarily explicitly, not necessarily by naming names, but by doing whatever it is that you had to do to keep your job, not to be blacklisted, not to be ostracized. The threat here was not literal death, but the threat was career death, and it was career death for some people in Hollywood at this time, to refuse point blank to go along with the drive to denounce all those enemies of the state that had infiltrated the movie industry. And some of those people were blacklisted. Some of them did never work again. Some of them did suffer career death. So Gary Cooper in this film represents courage in the face of bullying, where if you're part of the crowd, if you are a bit player, the easier thing to do is not necessarily to go along with the bullies, not to join the gang, not to become an outlaw, but to allow it to happen, to be an enabler, to be a bystander, to be a participant, and not part of the resistance. You mentioned Puritanism. Puritanism, for some people, has a sort of Blackadder version. It's just the philosophy of the killjoy. But also it had profound religious significance, including in the story you were just telling, and then in the United States. But the more extreme forms of Puritanism, not the Blackadder versions, but there are fairly extreme versions of Puritanism that emerge, including in America. Are they extensions of Calvinism, or are they, Calvin himself, would he see them as perversions or aberrations, do you think?
They certainly see themselves as extensions of Calvinism. They claim that tradition for themselves. And I think with good reason. Puritanism is a long, varied tradition. Depends what you're talking about.
By extreme, I mean the things that people think of as extreme.
Your classic Puritanism is obviously happening a lifetime later. And so many things have developed. What Calvin would have recognized, who knows? But I think we certainly can trace real continuities between the sort of piety that these people are trying to enact, the sort of society that they're trying to create, and some of the things that Calvin and his immediate disciples are doing. So yeah, that's direct. The difference, and I think this is important, especially once we get into the American context, is that by then we're moving away from the universalism of Calvin's vision, that sense that it embraces the whole of society, which in part, and this is something we keep coming back to, is an expression of failure, of defeat. That one of the common themes of a lot of the 17th century Puritans is that they've been unsuccessful in their attempts to reform society. The sinful lump is too profoundly corrupt. It can't be done. And so you withdraw. And of course, withdrawing across the Atlantic is only the most dramatic form of doing this. You set up this small godly community. And in some ways, you cross the Atlantic, then there you're able to create this perfect miniature republic in Massachusetts or wherever it might be. At least it's perfect until your own children grow up and start abandoning it. But I think this is one of the problems for the New Englanders, and indeed maybe for the United States as a whole. They always look back to the perfection of the first generation, which they're never able to recover because a self-selecting group of immigrants is different from the second, third generation. So, I mean, that's one way you can do it. But the other way it plays out, which I think in the long run is going to have more significance, is what happens in England itself during the Civil War era, when the hope, once Parliament has taken control of large parts of the country, is that they will finally be able to implement a proper Calvinist Reformation in England, basically turn England into a larger version of Scotland. And it doesn't work, in part because by then enough Puritans have got fed up with waiting for the whole of society to move with them, tarrying for the magistrate, as they would say. They're going to go ahead on their own account, and they're going to form these self-selecting independent communities, these congregationalist churches, which will each govern their own affairs without reference to wider structures like presbyteries or synods. Really, in many ways, no longer be a single church, but form these sects. And once you've done that, once you've taken that step, then there's nothing to stop you going further. And in particular, there's nothing to stop you taking the logical step that we talked about earlier and leaving behind this, what comes to seem to many people like this oddity of continuing to baptize infants. And this is the origin not of the Anabaptist churches, which go back to the 16th century and are a distinct and quite small line, but it's the origin of the Baptist churches that we know of that then become an enormous presence in the United States and from there around the world. The Baptists are a form of Calvinism that is adapted to a post-universalist age, to a sectarian era, in which it's possible, whether because you're in an England where central religious authority is broken down, or because you're in a North America which has never attempted or certainly never been able to impose any kind of religious uniformity on its whole population, that it's up to everybody to find their own path. And if you're going to follow anything in the Calvinist tradition from that point of view, you may as well belong to a community where one of the things that you can do is declare that individual faith. And so in some ways they revert to something that echoes Luther's original model of the appeal to conscience and of the individual standing before God.
The last question, was apartheid South Africa a Calvinist state?
Yes. The Dutch Republic is a Calvinist state of sorts. Certainly its overseas territories are, the Dutch Reformed Church is the only church which is allowed to operate there. And so that creates this very strong Calvinist community within the Dutch colony at the Cape of Good Hope. And that population ultimately gives rise to the Afrikaner population in South Africa, who are principally Dutch in descent and overwhelmingly Dutch Reformed in religion. So, apartheid is, I think you can see it as a sort of form of Calvinist heresy, that they are applying this notion of predestination of the chosen people. It's always got a strongly Israelite quality to it, the notion of predestination. It's one of the reasons why Calvinists don't get drawn into vicious anti-Semitism in the same way as Lutherans do, because they regard themselves as quasi-Jewish. And indeed, you have some openly, sometimes queasily philo-Semitic movements within Calvinism, but that's a different story. They use this model to interpret the very plural situation in which they find themselves, that they, the Reformed community, can clearly be identified with the white nation. And they turn this into, through a kind of weaponized reading of bits of the Old Testament, into a strong theology of nations in which God has created peoples to be different and has intended them each to have their own distinct role. And so when the term apartheid first starts to come into use in South Africa after the creation of the Union of South Africa at the end of the Boer War, so this is in the 1920s, 1930s, this is created by Calvinist theologians within the Dutch Reformed Church who are saying it is God's will that each of the many peoples of South Africa, they don't just talk about black and white, they're about the many different peoples. And indeed, some of them would want to separate out the Afrikaners from the Anglophone whites, who they regard as a mongrel people. Each of those peoples has been created by God, and it is therefore a defiance of God's will for them to be blended with one another, as all these metropolitan liberals would have us do. And so maintaining each of them in their own separate glory is the appropriate way to. And when you look at the way these theologians talk about their concept of apartheid, of separateness, there's an egalitarianism implicit in it, the sort of language of separate but equal, which is very much in vogue in the United States at the same period. These are terms that they use. And so all of the stuff about maintaining separate facilities, about bans on intermarriage and so forth is framed in those terms. Of course, that problematic in itself notion of equal separation is wildly different from the reality in which separation is imposed by one community entirely on its own terms and is framed alongside the seizure of enormous amounts of land. But it provides an ideological basis on which apartheid continues to draw throughout the period of the National Party's government from 1948 onwards. It keeps using this sort of language. Some of its politicians are openly cynical in the way that they are playing both sides of this, talking this language of equal separation while imposing the reality of something that is very, very far from equal and that doesn't have any of the consent that the theory pretends to. Hendrik Verwoerd will talk out of one side of his mouth on this subject, but absolutely doesn't conceal what he's doing. Many of the others, I think, genuinely strive to believe that this is what they're trying to do. And I mean, my reading, at least, of the story of the collapse of apartheid in the 1980s is partly, in large part, an effective critique of this theology being mounted by a series of other folks within South Africa. Desmond Tutu is significant in this, but Alan Boesak, who belongs to the so-called coloured wing of the Dutch Reformed Church, and who is able to mount in Calvinist terms a formidable theological critique of apartheid and suggest this whole notion of divinely ordained human separation is heretical, and to persuade the international gathering of the World Assembly of Reformed Churches to back this. The loss of moral confidence that the Dutch Reformed Church has in the notion of apartheid, which you can track in their documents through the 1980s, the increasing criticisms of it that are being voiced. I think this is crucial in the willingness of F.W. de Klerk, who himself is an elder of the Dutch Reformed Church, and a number of crucial folks within his community to negotiate this system away rather than to go down fighting. As at the time, we did not imagine that apartheid could possibly have ended as peacefully as it did. I know it wasn't peaceful. I think one of the reasons that that story is easily misunderstood from outside is that apartheid looks to us like a form of fascism. I think if we want to understand both the way that it was able unapologetically to maintain what it did for as long as it did, and then to negotiate itself away with such head-spinning speed, we need to understand that it's not fascism, it's Calvinism.
So over the last 3 days, that is 15 extracts. The full episodes have much more in them. And there are 35 other episodes as well, all available for you now. If you sign up to PPF Plus, it costs £5 per month or £50 for the year. You'll get all our future bonus episodes, ad-free listening, automatic sign-up to the newsletter. We are a small, independent podcast. We are a tiny team. We don't belong to one of the big podcast stables. And PPF Plus is what enables us to keep going and keep doing the podcast that we hope you enjoy. This has been Past, Present, Future.